Close your eyes for a second. Imagine stepping into your grandparents' kitchen. The smell of sizzling butter, warm cornbread fresh from the oven, and that familiar sound of a cast-iron skillet heating up. Back then, recipes weren't written on fancy cards, they were passed down through stories, through love, and through shared meals. Today, we're taking a flavorful journey back in time, through 25 lost African American recipes that our grandparents knew by heart. Some were born out of struggle, some out of celebration, but all of them carry history in every bite. So grab a chair, maybe a plate too, because this is going to be one delicious ride. Let's get started with 1. Hoe cakes. Before there were fluffy diner pancakes, there were hoe cakes, thin, crisp-edged cornmeal cakes cooked right on a griddle or, as the name suggests, on a hoe over an open flame by field workers. Enslaved Africans and later generations used what they had: cornmeal, water, salt, and maybe a splash of buttermilk if they were lucky. These cakes were quick energy during long workdays. You'd mix cornmeal with warm water and a pinch of salt until it's like pancake batter. Heat up that old cast-iron skillet, pour in a little bacon grease, and drop the batter in like golden coins. Let them bubble, flip once, and you've got a crispy, soft-centered hoe cake. Serve with molasses or honey. Simple, hearty, unforgettable. 2. Collard greens with smoked meat. Collard greens weren't just a side dish, they were a centerpiece. Slow-cooked greens simmered for hours with smoked ham hocks or turkey necks filled the house with that deep, savory aroma you can't fake. Greens have roots in West African cooking traditions. African Americans transformed them into soulful comfort food, especially in the South. Every family had their twist, some added hot sauce, some vinegar, some secret spices. You'd wash big bunches of collard greens, tear them up, and toss them into a large pot. Add onions, garlic, and those smoked meats. Fill with water or broth, season generously, then let it simmer low and slow for 2 to 3 hours. The meat falls off the bone, the greens soak up every flavor, and the broth, known as pot liquor, was so good folks would dip cornbread straight into it. 3. Buttermilk fried chicken. Before fast food chains made fried chicken a global sensation, African American grandmothers were already perfecting this golden masterpiece in their home kitchens. Fried chicken became popular because it could be eaten hot or cold, making it perfect for church picnics, family gatherings, and long travel days. Enslaved cooks brought unique seasoning and frying techniques that shaped Southern cuisine forever. Chicken pieces would be soaked overnight in tangy buttermilk, seasoned with salt, pepper, paprika, and maybe a family secret spice or two. Then dredged in flour and fried in bubbling oil until crispy outside, juicy inside. The crackle when it hit the oil. 4. Hot water cornbread. This isn't your regular cornbread. Hot water cornbread is rustic, crisp, and fried, a true heritage recipe that goes back centuries. It originated during times when baking powder and ovens weren't common in every home. By mixing cornmeal with boiling water and frying patties, families created quick, cheap, and delicious bread to accompany meals. You'd pour boiling water into cornmeal, stir fast, then shape the mixture into patties. Drop them into hot oil and fry until golden brown. The result? Crispy outside, soft inside, and perfect with greens or beans. 5. Sweet potato pie. No holiday table was complete without sweet potato pie. Long before pumpkin pie became mainstream, African American families were whipping up these velvety pies with love. Sweet potatoes were plentiful and affordable, making them the go-to for desserts in the South. This recipe reflects both African culinary roots and American adaptation. Boil and mash sweet potatoes, then mix with sugar, butter, eggs, milk, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. Pour into a flaky homemade crust and bake until the filling sets. The smell alone could pull the whole family into the kitchen. And that's just the beginning. We've got 20 more recipes, each with a story, a flavor, and a legacy. Up next, from red beans to homemade ice cream, the journey continues. 6. Red beans and rice. If you grew up in a Southern black household, then you know, Monday was red beans and rice day. But honestly, the prep started on Sunday. This wasn't just food, it was a rhythm, a tradition. A way to stretch simple ingredients into something comforting, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. The dish has roots in West African and Caribbean cooking, brought over by enslaved Africans and later adapted in Louisiana Creole culture. Red beans were affordable, filling, and paired perfectly with leftover pork bones from Sunday dinner. Grandma would soak dry red beans overnight, usually in a big ceramic bowl on the counter. The next morning, she'd sauté onions, celery, and bell peppers, the holy trinity of southern cooking, in a big pot with a hunk of salted pork or smoked sausage. The beans would go in, along with bay leaves, garlic, and maybe a splash of hot sauce. Then came the patience, slow simmering for hours, until the beans were creamy, the meat melted, and the whole house smelled like home. Finally, she'd serve it over fluffy white rice, maybe with a piece of hot water cornbread on the side. A simple meal, but one that fed the soul. 7. Oxtail stew. Oxtail stew was the kind of dish that took time. The kind of dish that turned tough cuts into pure tenderness. Back then, oxtail wasn't some fancy ingredient you'd find in restaurants. It was cheap, often discarded meat, but in the hands of our grandparents, it became gold. Enslaved people and later generations learned to transform less desirable cuts into delicacies through slow cooking and seasoning. Oxtail stew has Caribbean influences too, especially in black communities in the South. First, those bony pieces of oxtail were cleaned and seasoned with salt, pepper, and sometimes allspice. Then browned deeply in a heavy pot to build that rich, caramelized base. Next came onions, garlic, carrots, maybe some tomatoes or tomato paste, and a generous pour of water or broth. The stew would bubble on the back burner for hours, sometimes all afternoon, until the meat slid off the bone and the broth turned thick and silky. Serve it over rice or mashed potatoes, and you'd see everyone at the table fighting for the last drop of gravy. It wasn't just a stew, it was patience, care, and resourcefulness, a reminder that with love and time, even the humblest ingredients can become extraordinary. 8. Black-eyed peas with ham hocks. Every New Year's Day, without fail, there was a big pot of black-eyed peas simmering in the kitchen. For African American families, this wasn't just a dish, it was a symbol of hope and good fortune for the year to come. This tradition traces back to West African spiritual beliefs and the post-Civil War era. After emancipation, black-eyed peas became a sign of prosperity and survival. Serving them on New Year's Day was believed to bring luck and blessings. You'd start by soaking the dried black-eyed peas overnight. In the morning, Grandma would fry up onions, garlic, and maybe a little bit of bacon fat in a big stock pot. Then came the ham hocks, smoked, meaty, and full of flavor. She'd toss in the peas, cover with water, season with bay leaves, salt, and pepper, then let it simmer slowly until the peas were tender and the broth turned rich and savory. Sometimes she'd drop a whole jalapeno in for extra kick. Served with rice and collard greens, this meal wasn't just delicious, it was tradition served on a plate. 9. Catfish fry. Few things bring back memories like a good old-fashioned fish fry. Whether it was on a Friday night, a church picnic, or just a warm summer afternoon by the river, fried catfish was a community affair. Fishing has long been part of African American culture, especially in the South where rivers and lakes were abundant. Catfish became a staple because it was accessible, affordable, and perfect for frying. Fresh catfish fillets were soaked in buttermilk, then dredged in a seasoned cornmeal mixture, usually with salt, black pepper, paprika, and maybe a secret spice blend. Then, they'd be carefully lowered into a pot of hot oil, frying until crisp and golden brown. The sound of that sizzle was like music. The smell would drift down the street, pulling neighbors in like a magnet. Served with hot sauce, coleslaw, and a slice of white bread, this was more than food, it was fellowship, family, and good times. 10. Hand-churned vanilla ice cream. Before electric freezers and store-bought tubs, families made ice cream by hand. It was a summertime event, everyone took turns cranking, and the reward was the creamiest, freshest vanilla ice cream you'd ever taste. For many African American families, homemade ice cream was a rare treat. Ice was expensive, and making it by hand took effort. But on special occasions, Juneteenth celebrations, church picnics, or family reunions, the old wooden churn came out. The base was simple: milk, cream, sugar, vanilla, and egg yolks cooked gently into a custard. It was cooled, poured into the churn, surrounded by ice and rock salt, and then cranked, and cranked, and cranked some more. Kids usually got this job, laughing as their arms grew tired. Slowly, the liquid thickened, turning into soft, rich ice cream. A sprinkle of crushed peaches or strawberries sometimes made it extra special. When the lid came off, and that first scoop was served, everyone's faces lit up. It wasn't just dessert. It was togetherness, joy, and reward for shared effort. These dishes weren't just recipes, they were living memories. From simmering pots to summer celebrations, each bite carried a story. But we're not done yet. Next, we'll explore even more flavors. From biscuits to gumbo, recipes 11 through 15 are coming up. 11. Fluffy buttermilk biscuits. You ever wake up to the smell of fresh biscuits baking in the oven? That buttery, warm aroma wrapping around the house like a hug. For many African American families, fluffy buttermilk biscuits were the true sign of morning love. Biscuits became a staple in southern black kitchens during the 19th century. Wheat flour wasn't always easy to come by, but once it became affordable, families used it to create soft, fluffy breads that could stretch a meal. Buttermilk biscuits especially became popular because buttermilk was a common leftover from butter churning. Nothing went to waste. Grandma didn't need measuring cups. She just knew. She'd mix flour, baking powder, baking soda, salt, and cold lard or butter, working it quickly with her fingertips until the dough looked like coarse crumbs. Then came the cold buttermilk, turning everything into a soft, sticky dough. She'd gently pat it out, fold it once or twice for layers, and cut out biscuits with an old tin can. Onto a greased baking sheet they went, then into a hot oven until puffed and golden brown. She'd brush the tops with melted butter, and when those biscuits came out, phew! Split them open, add honey, jam, or a piece of fried chicken, and your morning was made. Biscuits weren't just breakfast, they were comfort, they were hospitality, they were tradition baked into every crumb. 12. Gumbo. If there's one dish that truly tells a story, it's gumbo. A rich, flavorful stew that represents centuries of African, Native American, and European influence, gumbo is more than food. It's culture in a bowl. The name, gumbo, comes from the West African word kimgambo, meaning okra, one of the dish's key ingredients. African slaves brought okra to the Americas, and it became a natural thickener for stews. Later, French settlers contributed the roux, while Native Americans added file powder. In African American kitchens, gumbo became a way to use whatever was available: seafood, chicken, sausage, vegetables, and feed a crowd. First came the roux, flour and oil stirred constantly over medium heat until it turned a deep chocolate brown. This step took patience. Grandma would stir and stir, never leaving the pot. Then came the Holy Trinity: onions, celery, and bell peppers, sizzling and soaking up that rich roux flavor. Next, she'd add garlic, okra, smoked sausage, chicken, sometimes shrimp or crab if it was a special day. Seasonings like thyme, bay leaves, cayenne, and black pepper turned the kitchen into a fragrant wonderland. A good gumbo simmered slowly, letting the flavors marry into something magical. Finally, it was ladled over white rice, maybe with a sprinkle of file on top. One spoonful, and you could taste history. Gumbo brought families together. It was the dish that made everyone gather around the table, laugh, talk, and share. It didn't matter what your day was like, gumbo made it better. 13. Neckbones and rice. Now here's a dish that proves something beautiful: you don't need expensive ingredients to create unforgettable meals. Neckbones and rice was once considered a poor man's food, but for those who grew up on it, this dish meant love, resourcefulness, and pure flavor. Back in the day, butcher shops would sell pork neck bones for next to nothing. Enslaved Africans and their descendants learned to transform these tough cuts into tender, flavorful meals through slow cooking. Over time, it became a staple in black households across the South. First, the neck bones were washed and seasoned with salt, pepper, garlic, and maybe some paprika. They'd be browned in a big pot to build that deep flavor base. Then onions, garlic, maybe a chopped bell pepper were added, followed by water or broth. This mixture simmered for hours, slowly turning the meat into tender bites that fell right off the bone. The broth became rich and meaty, almost like a stew. Finally, it was poured over hot white rice. Sometimes a little hot sauce or vinegar was added on top for an extra kick, but unforgettable. When neck bones and rice were on the stove, you knew dinner was going to be good, no matter how humble the ingredients. 14. Mustard greens with salt pork. Collard greens might get all the attention, but mustard greens were the sharp, peppery cousin that brought a different kind of flavor to the table. Cooked low and slow with salt pork, these greens had a bite that made you sit up and pay attention. Mustard greens were brought over from Africa and became a common part of Southern cooking. They were easy to grow, inexpensive, and packed with nutrients. Salt pork or fatback added the smoky, salty flavor that made the greens irresistible. Grandma would wash the greens thoroughly, tearing them into pieces and removing the tough stems. In a big pot, she'd fry some salt pork or fatback until crisp, then add chopped onions and garlic. Next, the greens would go in by the handful, wilting down as they cooked. A splash of broth or water, a dash of vinegar, a pinch of sugar, and maybe some crushed red pepper, then everything simmered slowly for an hour or more. The result was a pot of tender, flavorful greens with a slightly spicy kick, perfect with cornbread to soak up that pot liquor. Mustard greens weren't fancy, but on a chilly evening, they were exactly what your soul needed. 15. Tea cakes. Before chocolate chip cookies or fancy pastries, there were tea cakes, simple, sweet cookies that every grandma seemed to have a special recipe for. They weren't overly sweet, but they were full of flavor, memory, and love. Tea cakes trace back to the 18th and 19th centuries, when African American women working in kitchens adapted European cookie recipes using the ingredients they had: flour, sugar, butter, eggs, and maybe a hint of spice. They became a treasured treat, especially for children. Grandma would cream together sugar and butter until light and fluffy, then beat in eggs and a splash of vanilla. She'd add flour, baking soda, and sometimes nutmeg or lemon zest. The dough would be rolled out and cut into simple circles, then baked until golden at the edges. When they came out of the oven, the house smelled like heaven. Soft, tender, slightly crisp at the edges, tea cakes were often served with sweet tea, hence the name. But honestly, most kids didn't wait for tea. They'd snatch them straight off the cooling rack. Tea cakes weren't just cookies. They were after-school treats, Sunday surprises, and little pieces of childhood wrapped in sugar and flour. We're getting deeper into this delicious journey. From biscuits to gumbo to sweet tea cakes, these recipes remind us how creativity and heart turn simple ingredients into unforgettable flavors. But we've still got more. Part 4 will take us to recipes 16 through 20, including some crowd favorites you won't want to miss. 16. Pound cake. If you walked into a family gathering and saw a shiny aluminum bundt pan sitting on the counter covered with a towel, you already knew what it was: pound cake. Dense, buttery, and golden, this was the dessert that showed up for birthdays, holidays, church events, or just because grandma felt like baking something sweet. Pound cake has European roots, but African American families made it their own. Named for the original recipe that used a pound each of butter, sugar, eggs, and flour, this cake became a symbol of home hospitality in the South. It was simple, but it carried a lot of love. Grandma would set out the butter early so it softened just right. Then she'd cream it with sugar until light and fluffy. This step took time, but she never rushed it. Eggs went in one by one, followed by flour, a pinch of salt, and maybe a splash of vanilla or lemon extract. She poured the batter into a greased and floured pan, smoothing it with the back of a spoon. Into the oven it went, baking low and slow until the whole house filled with that sweet, buttery aroma. When it came out golden, she'd let it rest under a towel so it stayed moist. A thick slice of pound cake with a cup of coffee or sweet tea. That was Southern comfort on a plate. Pound cake wasn't flashy, but it was dependable, delicious, and always welcome. Just like family. 17. Smothered pork chops. Smothered pork chops were one of those dishes that could make everyone stop what they were doing and head straight to the kitchen. Tender chops, coated in flour, fried to a golden crust, then smothered in creamy onion gravy. You didn't need a menu. You just needed a fork. This dish became a household favorite in African American kitchens during the mid-20th century. Pork was affordable, and smothering was a cooking technique that stretched flavors and made sure nothing went to waste. Those pan drippings. Liquid gold. First, Grandma would season the chops with salt, black pepper, and maybe a little paprika. She'd dredge them in seasoned flour and fry them until they had that perfect crust. Then she'd take them out, toss sliced onions into the same pan, and let them soften and brown in those flavorful drippings. A little flour, a little broth or milk, and suddenly you had thick, rich gravy bubbling away. The chops would go back into the pan to simmer slowly until they were fall-apart tender. Served with mashed potatoes or rice, this was stick-to-your-ribs cooking at its best. The sound of those chops sizzling in the skillet was the sound of dinner you'd never forget. 18. Chicken and dumplings. On a chilly night, there was nothing like a warm bowl of chicken and dumplings. Tender chicken, rich broth, fluffy dumplings floating on top. This was the kind of dish that hugged you from the inside out. This dish has deep Southern roots and was common in African American households, especially during lean times. One chicken could feed a whole family if you stretched it with dumplings and broth. It was practical, comforting, and always loved. Grandma would start by boiling a whole chicken with onions, celery, carrots, and herbs until the meat was falling off the bone. She'd pull the chicken out, shred it, and strain the broth. Then she'd mix flour, baking powder, salt, and milk to make a soft dough, rolling or dropping dumplings right into the simmering broth. They'd puff up as they cooked, soaking in all that savory flavor. She'd return the chicken to the pot and let everything meld together until the broth was creamy and the dumplings tender. Served in deep bowls with maybe a sprinkle of black pepper, it was pure warmth. It wasn't fancy. But it was love, simmered slowly, served hot, and remembered forever. 19. Peach cobbler. You could smell it before you saw it, sweet, juicy peaches bubbling under a golden crust. Peach cobbler was the summer dessert. Whether made with fresh peaches or canned, it was always a crowd favorite at Sunday dinners and family reunions. Cobbler came from early settlers, but African American cooks transformed it. Using the fruits available to them, especially peaches in the South, they created cobblers that were rustic, simple, and full of flavor. Cobbler was easier to make than pies and perfect for feeding big groups. Grandma would slice ripe peaches, toss them with sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a bit of lemon juice, then let them sit so the juices turned syrupy. She'd melt butter in a baking dish, pour in a simple batter made from flour, sugar, milk, and baking powder, and then spoon the peaches right on top. As it baked, the batter rose through the fruit, creating that signature cobbled look, crisp on the edges, gooey in the center. Served warm with a scoop of hand-churned vanilla ice cream. Lord have mercy, that was happiness. Peach cobbler wasn't just dessert. It was the taste of summer, of togetherness, of pure joy. 20. Hoppin John. Hoppin John is one of those dishes that carries both flavor and meaning. A humble mix of black-eyed peas, rice, and smoky meat, it's traditionally eaten on New Year's Day to bring prosperity for the year ahead. Hoppin John's origins trace directly back to West Africa, where rice and beans were staple foods. Enslaved Africans brought these culinary traditions to the Carolinas, where they adapted them with local ingredients. The dish became a symbol of hope and resilience, especially during Reconstruction. To make it, Grandma would cook black-eyed peas with onions, garlic, bay leaves, and smoked ham hocks or bacon until tender. In a separate pot, she'd cook rice until fluffy. Then, she'd mix the two together, letting the flavors blend into one hearty, satisfying dish. Sometimes she'd add a little cayenne or chopped peppers for a kick. Served with collard greens and cornbread, this wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual, a wish for good fortune, and a reminder of heritage. Hoppin John tasted like tradition. Simple ingredients, deep roots, and a whole lot of meaning in every spoonful. We've explored comfort foods, celebration dishes, and recipes born out of creativity and resilience. But we're not finished yet.